when a maid's daughter pounded on the billionaire's door, begging, "Please, she's dying." His next move shattered every wall he'd built around his heart. "You have to help. They're hurting my mom." Those words broke the silence of a billionaire's fortress, a silence that had cost him millions to build. High in the misty mountains, where power lives behind glass and stone, one man believed he could buy peace. Caleb Hayes, heir, recluse, king of an empire, had mastered the art of keeping the world out. But on one storm-soaked night, the world came knocking, in the form of a terrified little girl clutching a soaked teddy bear. "Please," she whispered, "you have to help." And when Caleb Hayes opened that door, nothing, no wealth, no walls, could keep the storm from getting in. This is the story of how a child's cry shattered a billionaire's silence and changed everything that followed. A billionaire's fortress could keep the world out, but not a little girl's desperate plea. Caleb Hayes lived his life surrounded by a quiet he had paid millions to build. From his window, the world was a masterpiece of glass and steel, a monument to a name he inherited and a fortune he had multiplied tenfold. Caleb Hayes was 42 years old, and the years had taught him that silence was the most expensive commodity in the world. He had bought himself an entire mountain in the Pacific Northwest just to own the quiet that came with it. His home was not a house, but a sprawling structure of stone and glass, built to look out upon a kingdom of old-growth forests and misty valleys. It was a fortress against the noise of the world, against the endless demands of his company, and against the ghosts of a life he had locked away. He was the grandson of General Thomas Hayes, a man whose legend was carved into the granite of war monuments. People who spoke of Caleb often mentioned the general first, as if the old man's valor was the source code for the grandson's success. They saw the same steel in his eyes, the same unyielding set of his jaw. But where the general had commanded armies, Caleb commanded markets. He moved billions with a quiet phone call and shaped industries from the solitude of his study. Yet, the vast house echoed with the emptiness of a life lived at a distance. His staff were discreet, their footsteps muffled on polished concrete floors. His nights were spent in the company of leather-bound books and the low hum of the estate's climate control. The chair across from his fireplace was always empty, as was the other side of his king-sized bed. He was a man of intense routine. Mornings were for the markets in New York, conducted via a wall of screens that lit his face in the pre-dawn gloom. Afternoons were for walking the miles of trails that crisscrossed his property, his only companion a large Rhodesian ridgeback named Gus. Evenings were for silence. He did not entertain. He did not attend galas or court the fleeting affections of women who saw his name before they saw him. His world was vast, but his life was small, contained within the walls he had built to protect a solitude that felt, most nights, exactly like loneliness. That evening, the sky pressed down on the mountains, heavy and bruised. The wind began to whisper through the giant firs, a low moan that promised a storm. Caleb stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows in his living room, watching the clouds gather. The air smelled of rain and cold earth. It was a familiar smell, one that usually brought him a sense of peace, of the world being washed clean. But tonight, it felt different. Restless. Gus, lying by the hearth, lifted his head and let out a low growl, his gaze fixed on the front door. Caleb turned, his senses on alert. No one came here unannounced. The estate was a mile up a private, gated road. Any visitor was vetted by security long before they reached the house. He listened. The wind howled, rattling a loose pane somewhere in the west wing. But then he heard it, beneath the storm's rising voice. A sound that did not belong. It was a frantic, desperate pounding on the massive oak door. Not the confident knock of a guest, but the hurried, frightened drumming of a small fist. It was weak, yet it cut through the thick wood and the thick silence of the house with startling clarity. Caleb paused, a glass of whiskey halfway to his lips. Every instinct, honed in boardrooms where predators circled, sharpened to a fine point. He set the glass down slowly, the crystal making a soft click on the marble coaster. Gus was on his feet now, a low rumble in his chest, but he did not bark. He seemed to sense, as Caleb did, that this was not a threat, but something far more unsettling. He moved through the grand, shadowed foyer, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He did not turn on the lights. He reached the door and disengaged the heavy locks with a series of precise, quiet clicks. He pulled the door inward, a gust of wind and rain sweeping into the hall. There, on the wide stone porch, stood a little girl. She could not have been more than 9. Her blonde hair was plastered to her head, soaked with rain. Her face was pale, blotched with red from the biting cold. She wore only a thin pink coat, the kind meant for a mild autumn day, not a storm of this magnitude. Her small sneakers were soaked through, and she shivered uncontrollably, her small body trembling like a leaf in the gale. But it was her eyes that held him. They were wide and blue, and in their depths was a terror so profound it seemed to steal all the air from his lungs. It was a fear that went deeper than the storm. She looked up at him, this giant of a man silhouetted in the dark doorway, and her voice, when it came, was a fragile whisper that the wind nearly stole away. "Please," she begged, her teeth chattering. "You have to help." Caleb's own voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse. "You're a long way from anywhere, little one." "Who are you?" She swallowed hard, a tremor running through her. "My name is Grace," she whispered. She clutched a small, worn teddy bear to her chest, its button eyes seeming to stare up at him with the same desperation. "My mom, she works for you. She cleans the house. Her name is Eleanor." The name registered. Eleanor Vance. A quiet, almost invisible woman who came 3 days a week. He rarely saw her, catching only glimpses of her moving silently through the vast rooms. She kept her head down, her work efficient, her presence barely a whisper in the house. He knew she lived in one of the small staff cottages at the far edge of the property, down by the old service road. "What's wrong with your mother?" Caleb asked, his voice softening slightly as he crouched down, trying to lessen his intimidating height. The porch light cast long shadows, making him look even larger. Tears finally welled in the little girl's eyes, spilling over and tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "They beat my mom," she cried, the words tumbling out in a rush of pain and panic. "Rick," he heard her bad. "She's on the floor, and she's not getting up. I think she's dying." The words struck Caleb with the force of a physical blow. They echoed in the grand foyer, shattering the carefully constructed silence of his life. For a moment, he was frozen. He had dealt with corporate takeovers, with betrayals in the market, with the cold, calculated cruelty of men in expensive suits. He had not, in all his years, been faced with a terror so raw, so pure. He saw the bruises on the little girl's arms where she had likely been grabbed, the desperate way she held herself as if trying to keep from falling apart. He looked past her into the raging storm. The staff cottages were nearly a mile away, a treacherous walk in this weather, especially for a child. This girl had run through the dark, through the wind and the rain, fueled by a fear that had eclipsed her own safety. A fire ignited within him. It was not the hot flash of anger he felt in a negotiation, but a deep, cold fury. It was the legacy of his grandfather, the instinct of a protector that had lain dormant for decades. He had turned away from the world's messy, painful problems, preferring the clean logic of numbers. But a problem had just landed on his doorstep, shivering and terrified. "Get inside," he said, his voice firm but gentle. He stood and opened the door wider. "Right now." Grace hesitated for only a second, her eyes searching his. She saw something there, beyond the wealth and the power. A steadiness, a promise. She scurried past him into the warmth of the foyer, dripping water onto the pristine floor. Gus approached her slowly, sniffing her hand before giving it a soft lick. Caleb turned back to the storm. He grabbed a heavy, waxed canvas coat from the hall closet and pulled on a pair of sturdy boots. He didn't bother with a flashlight. He knew every inch of this land. "Stay with the dog," he commanded softly, looking back at the small, trembling girl. "Lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone but me. Do you understand?" She nodded, her wide eyes never leaving his face. She had run out of tears. All that was left was a fragile, desperate hope. He strode out into the night, the great door closing behind him with a heavy, final thud. The wind tore at him, plastering his coat to his body. The rain fell in blinding sheets. But his steps were long and sure, eating up the ground as he moved toward the distant cottages. He was no longer a billionaire in his castle. He was just a man, walking into a storm to answer a child's plea. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the rain, that whatever he found at the end of this path would change the quiet, ordered world he had built for himself forever. The silence was already broken. The journey to the staff cottages felt longer than a mile. The manicured path gave way to a muddy service road, the wind howling through the trees that lined it, making them groan like dying beasts. Caleb moved with a relentless purpose, his mind a cold, clear engine of focus. He pictured the quiet, unobtrusive woman, Eleanor, and the terror in her daughter's eyes. "They beat my mom." The words were a drumbeat in his head, fueling his pace. He reached the small cluster of cottages, modest but well-kept buildings set apart from the grandeur of the main estate. Only one had a light on, a weak, yellow glow that seemed to tremble in the darkness. The front door was slightly ajar, pushed open by the wind. A deep sense of dread settled in Caleb's stomach. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cottage was small, sparsely furnished but clean. A child's drawings were taped to the refrigerator. A small pair of muddy sneakers was placed neatly by the door. The air was thick with the metallic smell of blood and cheap whiskey. And on the floor, lying on a thin rug between the sofa and a shattered coffee table, was Eleanor. She was even smaller than he remembered. Her pale skin was marred by ugly, purple bruises. One eye was swollen shut, and her lip was split and bleeding. Her thin arms were covered in marks that looked like fingerprints, dark and brutal. She lay in a heap, as if she'd been tossed aside like a doll. For a terrifying second, Caleb thought Grace had been right, that he was too late. Then he saw the faint rise and fall of her chest. She was breathing, shallowly, painfully, but she was alive. He knelt beside her, his large frame suddenly feeling clumsy and out of place in the small, violated space. "Eleanor," he said softly. Her one good eye fluttered open. It took a moment to focus on him, confusion and then stark fear clouding her gaze. "Mr. Hayes," she whispered, her voice a hoarse, broken thing. "Grace, is my daughter safe?" "She's at the house." "She's safe," he assured her. She came for help. A single tear traced a path from her eye. "You shouldn't be here," she rasped. He'll make trouble for you." "Let him," Caleb said, the words coming out as a low growl. The cold fury inside him solidified into something hard and unyielding. He had seen the aftermath of violence before, in sterile reports and news articles. To see it here, in his own sanctuary, against a woman who worked under his protection, felt like a personal invasion. It was an offense against the order he cherished, an act of chaos that could not go unanswered. With a tenderness that felt foreign to his own hands, he gently slid his arms beneath her. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. A sharp gasp of pain escaped her lips, but she didn't protest. She was too broken, too exhausted to fight. She closed her eyes, her head lolling against his chest, and surrendered to the strange, disorienting feeling of being held. He carried her out of the cottage and back into the storm. He wrapped his own coat around her small, fragile body, shielding her from the worst of the wind and rain. Her breathing was a faint, ragged whisper against his chest. As he walked, his long strides never faltering, the storm seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was raging against the injustice of it all. He didn't feel the cold. He didn't feel the rain stinging his face. All he felt was the light, broken weight in his arms and the heavy, iron resolve solidifying in his soul. When he finally reached the main house, the massive door swung open before he reached it. Grace stood there, her small face illuminated by the warm light from the foyer. When she saw her mother, limp and pale in Caleb's arms, a small, choked sob escaped her. But it was followed by a wave of relief so powerful it seemed to light her up from the inside. Caleb carried Eleanor through the grand entrance hall, his muddy boots leaving a trail on the marble floors he would have reprimanded any staff for yesterday. He didn't care. He walked past priceless art and antique furniture, his focus solely on the woman in his arms. He took her to one of the main floor guest suites, a room larger than her entire cottage, with a roaring fireplace and a bed piled high with soft, white linens. He laid her down gently on the bed. The contrast was jarring, her bruised and broken body against the pristine, luxurious white of the duvet. She stirred, murmuring something about not being worthy, that she would ruin the sheets, but he placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Just rest," he said, his voice softer than he intended. Grace climbed onto the bed, curling up beside her mother, her small hand protectively covering Eleanor's. She tucked herself into her mother's side, a tiny guardian watching over her. Caleb backed away, giving them space. He stood by the fire, stoking the flames until they leaped high, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. He brought in a medical kit from his own bathroom, filled a bowl with warm water, and found clean cloths. With hands that could sign deals worth fortunes, he began to carefully, clumsily, clean the cuts on Eleanor's face. She winced but never cried out, her pride a silent, stubborn thing. He worked in a quiet focus, his gestures methodical. He was not a doctor, but he was a man who understood how to fix what was broken. Each gentle dab of the cloth was a silent vow. You are safe here. He will not touch you again. Outside, the storm raged, throwing sheets of rain against the thick windows. But inside that opulent room, a fragile sanctuary had been formed. Three strangers, brought together by violence and fear, found a tentative peace in the warm glow of the fire. As Eleanor drifted into an exhausted, pain-filled sleep, her daughter's soft breathing a steady rhythm beside her, she opened her good eye one last time. She saw Caleb Hayes sitting in a chair by the fire, his great shoulders slumped forward slightly, his face etched with lines she had never seen before. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a soldier standing guard, a lonely sentinel watching over their fragile camp. For the first time in a very long time, Eleanor closed her eye not in fear, but with a flicker of something she had long ago forgotten: hope. Caleb did not sleep. After Eleanor and Grace were settled, he retreated to his study, the room that served as the nerve center of his global empire. But tonight, the glowing numbers on the screens held no interest for him. He made one phone call, his voice low and clipped, devoid of emotion. He was speaking to a man named David Chun, the head of his personal security, a former federal agent who handled the delicate problems that wealth and power inevitably attracted. David, Caleb said, his voice ablaze in the quiet room. I have a situation at the estate. I need you here, and I need a background check. The name is Rick Peterson. He lives in town, likely has a record. Find out everything. Where he drinks, where he works, who his friends are. I want to know the color of his socks. There was a pause on the other end, then Chin's calm, professional voice. Understood, Mr. Hayes. Is there an immediate threat? Caleb looked out the window at the storm, which was finally beginning to subside. The first hints of a bruised, gray dawn were appearing on the horizon. The threat has already acted, he said, his voice flat and cold. Now it's my turn. He hung up. He sat in the dark for a long time, the silence of the house no longer a comfort, but a weight. He was a man who controlled his world through distance and logic. He built walls, both literal and metaphorical, to keep the messy, unpredictable chaos of human emotion at bay. But a 9-year-old girl had breached those walls, and now the chaos was inside. He felt an anger so profound it was almost clarifying. It was the kind of anger his grandfather had described, the kind that burns away all the trivialities and leaves only the mission. And the mission, Caleb understood with perfect clarity, was to ensure that the man named Rick Peterson never laid a hand on Eleanor or Grace again. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of pale, watery blue. Caleb had arranged for a private doctor, a discreet professional he kept on retainer, to come to the house. Dr. Evans was a quiet man with kind eyes who examined Eleanor with a gentle efficiency. He confirmed she had a concussion, 2 cracked ribs, and severe bruising, but no permanent damage. She was lucky, Dr. Evans said to Caleb in the hallway, his voice low. An inch to the left, and that blow to her head could have been fatal. She needs rest, and she needs to be away from whoever did this to her. Caleb's jaw tightened. That has been arranged. He spent the day in a state of suspended animation. He canceled his meetings. The stock market, for the first time in his adult life, seemed like a distant, irrelevant game. He found himself walking the halls of his own house as if seeing it for the first time. It was a museum, he realized. A beautiful, empty museum. He found Grace in the vast library, a room filled with thousands of books, from first-edition classics to modern thrillers. She was curled up in a leather armchair so large it seemed to swallow her whole, her small teddy bear perched on the armrest. She wasn't reading. She was just staring at the rows and rows of books, her expression one of quiet awe. Have you eaten? Caleb asked, his voice startling her. She jumped, her blue eyes wide. She shook her head. He led her to the kitchen, a gleaming expanse of stainless steel and marble that was usually the domain of his private chef. But the chef wasn't due for hours. Caleb, a man who had not made himself so much as a piece of toast in 15 years, found himself staring blankly at the contents of a commercial-grade refrigerator. "What do little girls eat?" he asked, feeling a helplessness that was entirely new to him. Grace giggled, a small, silvery sound that seemed to chase some of the shadows from the room. "Cereal?" she suggested. He found a box of Cheerios in the pantry and a carton of milk. He poured them into a bowl, his large hands fumbling with the simple task. He spilled some milk on the counter and cursed under his breath. Grace watched him, a small smile playing on her lips. For a moment, he wasn't the billionaire owner of the mountain. He was just a man trying to figure out how to work a carton of milk. As she ate, her small legs swinging back and forth from the high stool, a fragile normalcy began to settle between them. She told him about her school, about her favorite teacher, about the stray cat she'd been feeding near their cottage. He listened, saying little, but his attention was absolute. He learned that her father had been a soldier, like his grandfather, but that he had died in Afghanistan when she was a baby. He learned that her mother, Eleanor, worked 2 jobs, cleaning his house and waitressing at a diner in town, just to make ends meet. He learned that Rick was her mother's boyfriend, and that he had been nice at first, but then he started drinking, and the niceness had curdled into something mean and frightening. "Mommy said we were going to leave," Grace said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She was saving money. I think he found it. That's why he was so mad." Caleb's hands clenched into fists under the counter. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of quiet desperation and brutal control. Later that afternoon, David Chen arrived. He was a compact man with an air of quiet competence. He handed Caleb a slim manila folder. "Rick Peterson," Chen said, his voice neutral. 45 years old. Dishonorably discharged from the Army, assault. 2 DUIs. A restraining order from an ex-wife in Oregon. He works sporadically at the lumber mill outside of town. Spends most of his money at a bar called the Rusty Nail. He's not a complicated man, Mr. Hayes. He's a garden-variety bully. Caleb flipped through the report. The picture that emerged was one of a weak man who found his strength in hurting those smaller than himself. The anger in him, which had been simmering all day, began to cool, hardening into a sharp, pointed resolve. "Where is he now?" Caleb asked. "The Rusty Nail," Chen replied. "He's been there since noon." Caleb nodded slowly. "Good. Have 2 of your men watch the cottage. No one goes in or out. And have a team ready. When I call, I want Peterson removed from the property. Permanently." "Removed, sir?" Chen asked, his face unreadable. "I own the lumber mill, David," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "And the land it sits on. I own the company that holds the lease on that bar. I want his employment terminated. I want his patronage at the bar revoked. And I want him escorted off my land. He is not to set foot anywhere on this mountain again. Is that clear?" "Perfectly, sir," Chen said, a flicker of something that might have been admiration in his eyes. "And David," Caleb added, stopping him at the door, "arrange for Eleanor Vance's back pay to be tripled, and set up a trust for her daughter. A significant one. See to it personally." "Yes, Mr. Hayes." That evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Caleb left the house. He didn't take one of his expensive sports cars. He took a black, unassuming SUV from the garage. He drove down the winding mountain road, the tires crunching on the gravel. He was not dressed in one of his custom-tailored suits. He wore dark jeans, heavy boots, and the same waxed canvas coat from the night before. He looked less like a captain of industry and more like a man going to a fight. The Rusty Nail was exactly what its name suggested. It was a low-slung building on the outskirts of town, with a flickering neon sign and a parking lot full of pickup trucks. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and regret. A country song whined from the jukebox. A dozen or so men were scattered at the bar and tables, their faces illuminated by the dim, smoky light. Caleb scanned the room. He saw him immediately. Rick Peterson was sitting at the far end of the bar, hunched over a glass of whiskey. He was a big man, but soft in the middle, his face florid and coarse. He was laughing loudly at something the bartender said, a braying, unpleasant sound. Caleb walked the length of the bar, his presence sucking the air out of the room. The conversations faltered. The laughter died. Men turned on their stools to look at him, their eyes widening in recognition. Caleb Hayes never came into town, and he certainly never came to a place like the Rusty Nail. He stopped directly behind Peterson. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, a silent, towering presence. Peterson, feeling the sudden chill in the room, turned around slowly. He looked Caleb up and down, a belligerent sneer forming on his face. "Well, look what we got here," he slurred, his words thick with alcohol. "The king in his castle, come down to drink with the peasants. What can I do for you, your highness?" Caleb's eyes were like chips of ice. "You can step outside with me, Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable authority that cut through the bar's haze. Peterson laughed, a short, ugly bark. "And why would I do that?" "Because you laid your hands on a woman who lives on my land," Caleb said, his voice dropping even lower. "A woman under my protection." The sneer on Peterson's face wavered. A flicker of fear, or perhaps just surprise, crossed his features. He glanced around, looking for support, but the other men in the bar were suddenly very interested in their drinks. They knew power when they saw it, and the man standing before them radiated it from every pore. "I don't know what you're talking about," Peterson blustered, trying to regain his footing. "Ellie is clumsy. She falls a lot." Caleb's expression did not change. "Her daughter seems to think otherwise," he said. The mention of Grace seemed to finally pierce Peterson's drunken bravado. His face darkened with rage. "That little brat," he spat. "She's a liar. I ought to teach her some respect." That was the moment. The moment the last of Caleb's restraint evaporated. He reached out, his hand moving with a speed that was startling in a man his size. He didn't grab Peterson's shirt. He clamped his hand around the back of the man's thick neck, his fingers digging into the soft flesh like talons. Peterson yelped, his eyes bulging. The barstool clattered to the floor as Caleb hauled him to his feet with effortless strength. "Let's take that walk," Caleb said, his voice no longer quiet. It was a low, resonant growl, the sound of a predator that had been patient for far too long. He propelled the bigger man toward the door, Peterson stumbling and struggling, his feet barely touching the floor. The patrons of the Rusty Nail watched in stunned silence as the billionaire disappeared into the night, dragging the town bully with him as if he were nothing more than a sack of garbage. The heavy door swung shut behind them, leaving the bar in a silence more profound than any before. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp, a stark contrast to the stale warmth of the bar. Caleb dragged Peterson across the gravel parking lot, his grip like a vice. He stopped beside his SUV, the black vehicle looking like a block of polished night. He slammed Peterson against the side of the car, the impact making the man's teeth rattle. "You think you're a tough man, don't you?" Caleb's voice was a low, guttural sound, devoid of the refined tones he used in his boardrooms. This was something older, something more primal. Peterson, a mix of drunken rage and burgeoning fear, struggled against Caleb's grip. "Get your hands off me. You can't do this." "I can do whatever I want," Caleb said, his face inches from Peterson's. The smell of cheap whiskey on the man's breath was nauseating. "This is my town. The mill where you work? I own it. This bar? I own the building. The apartment you rent? I own that too. You have lived your life on my charity, and you have repaid that by brutalizing a woman and terrifying a child." Peterson's struggles ceased. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. The full scope of his situation was dawning on him, cutting through the alcoholic haze. He wasn't just in a fight with some rich guy. He was in a fight with the god of his small, miserable world. I didn't," he stammered, the fight going out of him, replaced by a pathetic, whining fear. "She's lying. They're both lying. I saw her," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "I saw what you did. And for that, your life as you know it is over. You're fired from the mill, effective immediately. Your lease is terminated. You have 24 hours to pack your things and be gone. You are no longer welcome in this town or in this county. If I see you, or hear of you, anywhere near this mountain again, I will not be this polite." He emphasized the final word by shoving Peterson away. The man stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet and landing hard in the gravel. He looked up at Caleb, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. He had built his identity on being the toughest man in the room, the one who inspired fear. Now he was nothing, a bug about to be squashed. Caleb didn't give him a second glance. He turned and got into his SUV, the engine starting with a low, powerful hum. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he saw Peterson in the rearview mirror, still sitting in the gravel, a pathetic, broken figure in the faint glow of the bar's neon sign. Two dark sedans, unnoticed until now, pulled into the lot, and several of David Chin's men, dressed in plain, functional clothes, got out and began to walk toward Peterson. The cleanup had begun. Caleb drove back up the mountain, the anger inside him slowly receding, leaving behind a strange and unfamiliar emptiness. He had dismantled a man's life with a few words and a phone call. It had been easy, surgical, and yet it felt hollow. It was justice, of a sort, but it didn't erase the bruises on Eleanor's face or the terror in her daughter's eyes. It was a solution, but it wasn't a resolution. When he returned to the house, it was quiet. A single lamp was lit in the living room, casting long shadows across the cavernous space. He found Eleanor there, wrapped in a thick cashmere blanket, sitting on the edge of one of the large sofas. She looked small and lost in the opulent room. She stood up when he entered, her movements stiff and painful. "Grace told me what you did," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "She said you went into town." "I had a conversation with Mr. Peterson," Caleb said, his tone clipped and formal. "He will not be bothering you again." Eleanor looked at him, her one good eye searching his face. He was a man of immense power, a man who could move mountains and crush men like Rick without a second thought. And he had wielded that power for her. It was terrifying and humbling all at once. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling impossibly small. "But you shouldn't have. He's a mean man. He'll try to get back at you." "He is welcome to try," Caleb said, a hint of steel in his voice. He walked over to the fireplace and added a log to the dying embers. "You and Grace will stay here, in this house, for as long as you need. You are safe now." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. But for Eleanor, it wasn't that simple. She had spent her life being fiercely independent, working for every scrap she had. To be a charity case, living in the billionaire's castle, was a kind of surrender she wasn't prepared for. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "I am grateful, more than I can ever say. But I can't stay here. I'm your maid. It isn't right." Caleb turned from the fire to face her. The flames cast a flickering light on his hard, chiseled features. "You are not my maid, Eleanor. Not anymore. You are my guest. And Grace." He paused, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Grace is a brave little girl who ran through a storm for her mother. This house is big enough. Let us be of some service to you." His words were a command, but they were wrapped in a strange, formal kindness. Before she could protest further, a small figure appeared in the doorway. It was Grace, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, her teddy bear clutched in her hand. "Mommy," she said, her voice small. "I had a bad dream." Eleanor immediately went to her, kneeling down to wrap her in a hug. "It's okay, sweetie. I'm right here." Grace looked past her mother at Caleb, who was still standing by the fire, looking impossibly large and out of place in the tender scene. "Are you going to be our new dad?" she asked, her child's logic cutting straight to the heart of the matter. The question hung in the air, stunning both adults into silence. Eleanor's face flushed with a deep, mortified red. "Grace, you don't ask people things like that," she scolded gently. But Caleb didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss it. He simply looked at the little girl, and a strange, sad smile touched his lips. It was the first time Eleanor had ever seen him smile. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and revealing a glimpse of a different man beneath the armor. "No," he said, his voice softer than Eleanor had ever heard it. "I'm just a friend." He turned and left the room, leaving mother and daughter bathed in the warm light of the fire. Eleanor held Grace tight, her heart a confused and tumultuous sea of gratitude, fear, and a strange, burgeoning warmth. She had been saved by a man who was a stranger to her, a man who lived in a world she could barely imagine. And now, she and her daughter were living in the heart of that world, two small, shipwrecked souls washed up on the shores of an unimaginable fortune. She didn't know what the future held, but as she listened to the sound of Caleb's footsteps receding down the long, silent hall, She knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed settled into a strange and quiet routine. Eleanor's bruises began to fade, from angry purple to a mottled yellow-green. Her ribs still ached, a constant reminder of the life she had escaped. She and Grace lived in the guest suite, a luxurious prison of sorts. The staff, under Caleb's strict orders, treated her with a polite, deferential distance. They brought her meals on silver trays and changed the linens daily. But Eleanor felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life. She tried to make herself useful, to clean or to cook, but the staff would gently, firmly, refuse her help. "Mr. Hayes's orders, ma'am," they would say, their faces impassive. Caleb himself was a distant, yet constant, presence. He would leave for his study before they woke and often return late at night. But there were small signs of his attention everywhere. A collection of classic children's books appeared on the table in their suite. A new, perfectly child-sized bicycle was parked by the front door. He would join them for dinner some evenings, sitting at the head of a dining table, so long it felt like they were shouting across a canyon. The conversations were stilted and awkward, filled with long silences. Caleb would ask Grace about her day, listening to her childish chatter with a grave, focused attention. He would ask Eleanor if she needed anything, his questions always polite, always formal. For Grace, the house was a wonderland. She explored its endless rooms, her footsteps echoing in the grand, empty spaces. She played with Gus, the big dog, who followed her around with a gentle, protective loyalty. She had found a friend in the most unlikely of places. She would sit with Caleb in the library while he read his financial reports, she with one of her new storybooks, the two of them sharing a comfortable silence that baffled her mother. Grace was not afraid of Caleb. She seemed to understand him in a way the adults could not. She saw past the wealth and the power to the quiet, lonely man underneath. One afternoon, Eleanor found Grace in the library, sitting on the floor with a large, leather-bound book open in her lap. It was a photo album. Caleb was standing over her, pointing at a picture. "That was my grandfather," he was saying, his voice soft with a rare hint of warmth. "General Thomas Hayes. That picture was taken just after the war." Eleanor moved closer. The picture was of a young man in a crisp military uniform, his eyes holding the same steely intensity as his grandson's. But there was a smile playing on his lips, a look of confidence and hope. "He looks like you," Grace said. "He was a better man than me," Caleb replied, his voice flat. He closed the book gently. "He fought for people. I just fight for numbers." He looked up and saw Eleanor standing in the doorway. A shadow crossed his face, and the familiar mask of distant formality slipped back into place. "Eleanor," he said, his tone once again polite and remote. "I trust you are feeling better." "Much better, thank you," she said. "Mr. Hayes, we can't impose on you like this any longer. I'm well enough to work. I need to find a new job, a new place for us to live." "That has been taken care of," he said, as if discussing a minor business transaction. "My security chief, Mr. Chun, has secured a small house for you in the next town over. It's a safe place. The first 6 months' rent have been paid. There is also a job for you at the local library, if you want it. The pay is adequate." Eleanor was stunned into silence. He had rearranged her life with the same quiet efficiency with which he had dispatched Rick Peterson. He had given her a home, a job, a future. He had done it all without even asking her. "Why?" she finally whispered, the question that had been burning in her heart for days. "Why are you doing all of this for us?" Caleb looked away from her, his gaze settling on the mountains visible through the large library window. For a long moment, he said nothing. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. "My grandfather used to say that a man is measured by what he protects," he said at last, his voice low and reflective. "For a long time, I thought that meant protecting my assets, my company, my legacy. I've built walls around my life to keep the world out. But your daughter, she ran through all of them." He turned back to face her, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his armor. She saw a profound, aching loneliness. "You and your daughter needed help," he said simply. "And I was here." It was not a full explanation, but it was more than she had expected. It was a glimpse into the heart of the man who had saved her. She understood then that in helping them, he was also, in some way, trying to save himself. The move happened 2 days later. A black car, as silent and discreet as everything else in Caleb's world, arrived to take them to their new home. Leaving the estate felt like waking from a strange, vivid dream. As the car pulled away, Grace pressed her face to the rear window, waving at the huge stone-and-glass house until it disappeared behind the trees. Gus, the dog, stood on the front steps, watching them go, a lonely sentinel at the gates of the fortress. Eleanor's hands were clenched in her lap. She was a bundle of nerves, a knot of gratitude and anxiety. Caleb had not come to see them off. He had left early that morning, as usual. His goodbye was a thick envelope left on the hall table, addressed to her in his sharp, decisive handwriting. Inside, she had found a cashier's check for an amount that made her gasp, along with a simple, typed note, a new beginning. CH. The new house was a small, blue cottage on a quiet, tree-lined street in the neighboring town of Cedar Creek. It was the kind of house Eleanor had sometimes dreamed about, with a small porch for a rocking chair and a little patch of yard where Grace could play. It was modest, clean, and utterly, terrifyingly perfect. It was another gift, another link in the golden chain of Caleb's charity that bound her to him. As they walked through the front door, they found the house was not empty. It was fully furnished, from the comfortable sofa in the living room to the brand-new beds in the two small bedrooms. The kitchen was stocked with groceries. There were new clothes in the closets, in her size and Grace's. In the smaller bedroom, a collection of toys and art supplies was arranged neatly on a new desk. Eleanor sank onto the sofa, overwhelmed. It was too much. It was the kindness of a king, a kindness so vast it felt like a form of control. She had escaped one man who wanted to own her, only to be saved by another whose generosity threatened to swallow her whole. Grace, however, felt none of her mother's conflict. She ran through the small house, her squeals of delight echoing in the freshly painted rooms. "Mommy, look, he got me the paint set I wanted. The one with all the colors." Eleanor walked into the bedroom and saw the elaborate art set. She remembered Grace pointing it out in a store catalog weeks ago, a casual, childish wish her mother couldn't afford. Caleb must have heard. He must have listened to their quiet conversations, filing away the details with that unnerving focus of his. He wasn't just providing for them. He was paying attention. The thought was both comforting and deeply unsettling. Life in Cedar Creek was quiet. The town was small, and the people were friendly in a reserved, polite way. Eleanor started her job at the library, a peaceful, orderly world of books and whispers that felt like a balm on her bruised soul. She enjoyed the work, the simple task of shelving books and helping people find stories. Grace started at the local school and, after a few shy days, began to make friends. For the first time in years, a fragile sense of normalcy began to bloom in their lives. They had a home. They were safe. Yet, Caleb's presence lingered. A car, discreet and dark, was always parked somewhere down the street. A silent guardian she knew was one of David Chen's men. When her first paycheck from the library arrived, she found it was double the amount she had been quoted. A call to the head librarian, a flustered Mrs. Gable, revealed the truth. "A private benefactor made a grant to the library, dear," she had explained, "specifically to supplement the salaries of our staff. We are all very grateful." Eleanor knew who the benefactor was. He was an architect of realities, shaping her life from a distance. His money and power the invisible scaffolding that held up her new world. She felt a growing frustration, a desperate need to stand on her own 2 feet. But everywhere she stepped, the ground was already owned by Caleb Hayes. She saw him only once in those first few weeks. She was walking home from the library when his black SUV pulled up beside her. The tinted window slid down, revealing his face. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than she remembered. "Eleanor," he said, his voice the same low rumble. "Are you well? Is the house to your liking?" "It's too much, Mr. Hayes," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "The money, the furniture, the job. I can't accept it all. I have to pay you back." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "There is no debt," he said. "But there is," she insisted, her voice rising with a passion that surprised her. "You saved us, and I will be grateful for that for the rest of my life. But I can't live a life you've purchased for me. I have to be my own person." Grace has to see her mother as someone who can stand on her own. A long silence stretched between them. The car idled, a low hum in the quiet afternoon. "I understand," he said at last, and she was shocked to see a flicker of what looked like pain in his eyes. The arrangements are made. They cannot be undone, but I will not interfere further. He looked as if he wanted to say more, but he didn't. The window slid up, and the car pulled away, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, her heart pounding. She had spoken her truth, but it hadn't felt like a victory. It had felt like she had just pushed away the only person in the world who had ever truly tried to help her. After that day, the direct signs of his influence seemed to cease. The black car that shadowed her street was gone. There were no more mysterious gifts. He seemed to be keeping his word. The silence that followed was what she had asked for, but it was also profoundly lonely. She found herself thinking of him more than she wanted to admit, remembering the strange, sad smile on his face in the library, the clumsy way he'd poured a bowl of cereal, the surprising gentleness in his hands when he tended to her wounds. One crisp autumn evening, about a month after they had moved, Eleanor was helping Grace with her homework at the kitchen table. The little house was filled with the smell of baked chicken and the soft sound of Grace humming to herself as she colored a map of the United States. It was a scene of perfect, domestic peace. The knock on the door shattered it. It was not a loud knock, but it was sharp, insistent. Eleanor froze, her blood turning to ice. Grace looked up, her eyes wide with a familiar fear. "Mommy," she whispered. Eleanor put a finger to her lips, her heart hammering against her ribs. She crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. On her small porch, bathed in the yellow glow of the porch light, stood Rick Peterson. He looked different, thinner. His face was gaunt, and his eyes had a wild, desperate look. He was no longer the swaggering bully from the bar. He looked like a cornered animal. He knocked again, harder this time. "Ellie, I know you're in there. Open the door. Please, I just want to talk." Eleanor's whole body trembled. She backed away from the window, grabbing Grace and pulling her into the back bedroom. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Don't make a sound." She ran back to the kitchen, her mind racing. She had no phone. In her pride, in her foolish attempt to cut all ties to Caleb's charity, she had refused the cell phone David Chun had tried to give her, insisting she would get her own when she could afford it. Now she was cut off. Alone. "Ellie, come on." Rick's voice was louder now, pleading and angry at the same time. "He ruined me. That bastard Hayes. He took everything from me. I got nothing left. You owe me." He began to rattle the doorknob. Then his shoulder hit the door. The wood groaned in protest. Eleanor looked around frantically, her eyes landing on a heavy iron skillet on the stove. She grabbed it, its weight a cold, solid thing in her trembling hands. This was her house, her life. She would not let him break this too. The door frame splintered. The lock gave way, and the door flew open. Rick stumbled into the living room, his eyes wild and unfocused. He saw her standing there, skillet in hand, and a cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face. "There you are," he slurred. "We're going to have a little talk, you and me." He took a step toward her, but before he could take another, a new voice cut through the tense silence. A voice that was calm, cold, and utterly lethal. "I believe the lady asked you to leave." Rick froze. He turned slowly. Standing in the shattered doorway, silhouetted against the night, was Caleb Hayes. He was not dressed in a suit or a canvas coat. He wore a simple dark sweater and jeans, but he seemed to fill the entire space, his presence an immovable object. He didn't look angry. He looked perfectly, terrifyingly calm. Rick's bravado crumbled, replaced by a raw, primal fear. "You," he whispered. "Me?" Caleb agreed, his voice a low growl. He took a step into the room. "I kept my word, Eleanor. I did not interfere, but I never stopped watching." He had lied. The surveillance had never stopped. The knowledge of it, which would have angered her yesterday, now flooded her with a profound, overwhelming relief. "This ain't your business," Rick stammered, trying to find some scrap of his old defiance. "You are in a house I am paying for," Caleb said, his voice dropping dangerously low. "Threatening a woman I have placed under my protection. You have made this my business. And now, you and I are going to take a walk. For the last time." Caleb moved with that same surprising speed he'd shown in the bar. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't grab Rick. He didn't touch him. He simply stood before him, his sheer size and the cold promise in his eyes enough to make the other man flinch back as if he'd been struck. "Get out," Caleb said. It was not a request. It was a command that resonated with absolute power. Rick scrambled backward, stumbling over his own feet. He turned and fled, disappearing into the night like the coward he was. The silence he left behind was heavy. Eleanor stood in the middle of the room, the skillet still clutched in her hand, her body shaking with the aftermath of terror. Caleb turned to her. The coldness in his eyes melted away, replaced by a deep, aching concern. He gently took the skillet from her hands and set it on the table. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. She couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears finally beginning to stream down her face. And then, she did something that surprised them both. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his chest. She sobbed, great, shuddering cries of fear and relief. For a moment, he stood stiff and unmoving, his body rigid with surprise. He was not a man who was used to being touched. But then, slowly, hesitantly, his arms came up and wrapped around her, holding her with a surprising tenderness. He rested his chin on the top of her head, one large hand stroking her hair. "It's over," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her ear. "He will never come back. I promise you." They stood like that for a long time, two lonely people finding a fragile comfort in each other's arms in the middle of a wrecked living room. In the doorway of the bedroom, Grace watched them, her teddy bear held tight. She was not afraid anymore. She looked at the big man holding her mother, and she smiled. The monster was gone. The protector was here. And for the first time, her little blue cottage truly felt like a home. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.